Welcome to Red Line TV. We're looking at the connection between mental health and capitalism. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 300 million people suffer from depression worldwide. 23 million are suffering from symptoms of schizophrenia, while approximately 800,000 people each year commit suicide. Apparently 27% of the adult population, so the statistics, have experienced mental health problems, which if anything seems quite a low figure, especially considering COVID lockdowns and the cost of living crisis, both of which will have seen far more people deal with stress, anxiety and depression. Tonight and next week's program, we want to discuss how many of those cases are down to individual, biological or genetic reasons, which is how mainstream medicine tends to look at mental health issues, or how they are a reflection of the malaise of capitalism. Can we distinguish even between mental illnesses caused by social conditions, poverty, insecure living arrangements, and those which derive from physical or neurological conditions? We have an interview with Dr. Bob Gill in which he indicates that that's actually not that easy to establish. So speaking as a woman, her best years, it seems clear that there are physical hormonal reasons for anxiety, for example, that can be successfully treated by medication. We also want to look at how this mental health pandemic is affecting drugs use and abuse, and if there are better ways of living and working. For example, do mental health problems occur in sort of primitive communist societies that were not divided into classes? And how can we get back to a more human way of living, or go forward to a more human way of living? Should say that in the run-up to this program, we had a bit of controversy. We first called the program "Is Capitalism Driving Us Crazy?" And we've had a few complaints about that, where people who are suffering from mental health problems got in touch with us and said they don't agree with that, and they feel it's quite a demeaning way of talking about their issues. So we've changed it to "Is Capitalism Driving Us Mentally Ill?" But Jackie has a different view on that. Let's hear it, Jackie.
I want to reclaim the word crazy and mad, because I think to call what we're talking about mental illness, first of all, suggests that the majority of us don't experience it in this kind of society, and we do, and we need to start being honest about this. What we're feeling are actually healthy responses against capitalism. They're about anger, they're about frustration, they're about alienation, they're about terror. I mean, there was this woman halfway up a scaffold on top of a motorway today, this young woman who was crying, and she was crying because she said, "I know everyone's going to hate me, but I am so scared that I am going to die." You know, that's not mental illness to feel like that. It is healthy to feel like that. And I want to reclaim that word, because to call it mad actually encapsulates for me the fact that we are so angry with what is happening. And I don't want to pretend that that's not what's going on, or that I need to go to a doctor to actually tell me what this is. I'm not saying we don't need at times to go and get some kind of help, by the way, that the reason that we do, the reason that this has been medicalized, is for us to forget that actually the way that we're feeling mostly is absolutely normal. And I can say quite happily to people, I've gone through periods of being depressed and crazy and mad. And when I was being suspended and expelled and publicly shamed by the Labour Party, I was absolutely depressed, enraged, alienated, and out of my mind with what was happening. And if I hadn't have been, I wouldn't have been a healthy person. So I'm reclaiming mad and crazy.
course, I mean, a lot of people, I mean, they, you know, when you get depression, it can also be the opposite, you know, not the mad kind, but the debilitating kind where you can't get out of bed, and, you know, that doesn't feel like a good thing. It feels like a bad thing.
Actually, that's alienation. That's the result of alienation, when you feel you can't do anything. And I know we were going to come on to this, or I was going to come on to this later, you know, what is the solution of this? The solution of it is to become active, because I know for me, what was terrible about that time, what made me mad at that time, was being silenced and to feel that I was out of control. And that is the worst thing that can happen to any of us. So that young woman who's up on that scaffold, risking her life and knowing that she's going to be hated, what she's doing is really, really good for her mental health and for our mental health too.
Might not agree with the tactic necessary of individual action like that, but yeah, it certainly is a reflection of what's going on in society and how people fight back indeed. We're going to go into short discussion with Dr. Bob Gill, who is a GP and who's getting quite a lot of people coming to see him over this period. Bob, as a GP, you undoubtedly see many cases of mental health problems. There is within mainstream medicine an attempt often to explain those issues individually and biologically, for example, genetics or because of a chemical imbalance in the brain. What is your view on mental health in general?
Yeah, so you know, there's always this debate about environment versus genetics and other factors, but I think it can be misleading, because a lot of how we form and develop is dependent on our family circumstances, our degree of comfort, wealth, and security. So those are the things I think we should be concentrating on, because they're the ones that can be modified. You cannot change your genetics. It might be of interest to know there's a genetic history of depression or whatever, but you cannot influence that. So we should focus on the environmental and economic factors that we can alter. Yeah, so anxiety, depression, addiction, self-destructive behavior, self-harm are diseases of despair, which are dependent on your surroundings, your environment, and your support structures. So that's the sort of person that I'm seeing. Often, you know, they just want what they think is a quick fix. And the frustration from my point of view is just issuing a prescription doesn't really get to the fundamentals, the sort of foundation of their problem. And, you know, even if we try and refer people to counseling or cognitive behavioral therapy, that is not directed at getting to the root of the problem. You cannot change people's financial circumstances by talking to them, if that's the main cause of their problem. So it is frustrating, and equally in the case of children, when children are presenting with worrying behaviors, detachment, anxiety, obsessive rumination, self-harm, well, the barriers to accessing specialized care are extremely high. I'll give you one example of a child whose mother caught him about to jump out of the top floor window in their house, who was denied access to child and adolescent mental health services. And they were told that unless he does actually successfully harm himself, they cannot take him as a patient. So these are the problems and frustrations we're witnessing on a daily basis.
Is that getting worse? Are these services being cut back more?
Yeah, you know, you get an administrative response saying your patient, the child, doesn't meet the criteria. We won't even bother assessing them. You know, try and tap into resources within the school. So, you know, patients are left abandoned. The services just aren't there. The demand is escalating, and healthcare professionals just aren't available. You know, the NHS is losing staff left, right, and center.
If you could sort of put a figure on it, what do you think percentage-wise? I mean, I'm sure there are people who have that genetically predestined, perhaps, or, you know, have an imbalance of some sort. Can you sort of indicate or guess how many people, you know, have it as an individual biological reason and how many have it sort of for society factors?
So in primary care, the vast majority of the people I see as a GP are presenting with anxiety and depression as a reaction to circumstances. So that's the vast majority. If you go into the family history, there may be, you know, a greater propensity to getting depressed or anxious if there's a strong family history. That may double the risk. But, you know, there's so many people facing problems with basics in life, you know, housing, food and shelter and access to decent social and public services. That seems to be the majority of my caseload.
What role does the pharma industry play in this context? I mean, mental health problems could probably quite profitable, aren't they? All the various medications that exist. Are they pushing for those kind of diagnoses? You know, that you have to give pills and tablets. Is that pressure that you feel as a GP?
Not so much as a GP. A lot of the drugs that were, you know, came out 15, 20 years ago, they're off patent now, these SSRI drugs, which are used for anxiety and depression. Perhaps in the secondary care sector, where you've got novel antipsychotic drugs coming out, they're pretty expensive. There seems to be an expansion in prescribing amongst children with autistic spectrum disorders, ADHD, and those drugs are expensive. So there seems to be a widening of medicalization of mental disorder and neurodiversity amongst children. So that I think could be a sign of big pharma's influence on the practice of medicine. But certainly private healthcare within the NHS has had a huge impact on mental health, because more than half the beds for mental health, acute mental health care within the NHS that we pay for are in the private sector now. And some of the providers of these mental health beds have very dodgy track records, you know, so they've been involved with various scandals where they've employed underqualified people, not treated the patients with dignity and respect, and in some cases outright abuse. So we are shifting funding into the private sector, and by doing that, you're actually making the NHS provision weaker and more fragmented.
Considering that the abolition of capitalism is probably not on the agenda anytime soon, what is sort of the solution to, you know, like a band-aid that within capitalism can be applied?
In terms of stabilizing the NHS and keeping hold of the mental health professionals that we still have, you need to do something about pay. You need to restore their pay that has suffered 20 to 30% real terms cut since the banking crash in 2008, because otherwise you're going to lose that experience, that organizational memory. We need to counter the drive to downskill medicine and mental health services. So you're replacing psychiatrists with less trained people, sometimes just a social worker or a mental health professional, you know, people with minimal training. There is also a huge scarcity of NHS funded psychotherapists. So people who have quite complex needs, what they require to get better and to gain more insight is specialized psychotherapy. And that is as rare as hen's teeth within the NHS to access it. So the needs aren't being met. And it can only get worse if you do not stabilize the hemorrhage of the staff out of the NHS.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you.
More cases, fewer provisions, and I think Bob was quite certain that it has to do with the way most people live. He says he hardly ever comes across any cases which are not down to a severe change in people's circumstances, financially, poverty, etc. And Mike, you've looked at the spirit level of the book, and you found some rather interesting graphics that you wanted to share with us. Can you just talk us through these then?
Sure, thanks, Tina. And I suspect a lot of comrades have come across Wilkinson and Pickett's work in the past. It's been around now for over a decade, and what it provides for us, importantly, is very, very clear empirical evidence of not a correlation between income inequality, and they're talking particularly about income rather than wealth inequality, and social problems of all kinds, not a correlation, but a direct cause and effect relationship. So as you can see from this graph in the book, is littered with the empirical data and visual representations of that data like this, where you have countries with narrower levels of income inequality, the prevalence of mental health is lower. Where you have countries with higher levels of income inequality, our own included in the USA, you have higher levels of mental health. And this goes right across a range of all kinds of social problems, from educational outcomes to crime levels, prison populations, and of course addictions, which are incorporated within mental health. The next slide, if you have it there, Tina, as well, is instructive again, and particularly instructive for us as socialists. In countries, again, with lower levels of income inequality, you have higher levels of trust. When sociologists routinely ask the population, do you trust strangers? In countries with narrower levels of inequality, more people say they trust strangers. In countries with wider levels of inequality, there are less favourable levels of trust between people. Now, without going into detail, and I'm sure comrades either in the programme next week or tonight can comment on precisely what's going on here, but this has some implications for us, of course, because in a society which is fractured, has limited social bonds, fraying social bonds, the capacity of socialists to nurture solidarity between working class people and within organisations is more difficult, it's more challenging. And of course, it clarifies exactly why it's important to win the kind of disputes that are going on at the moment, to narrow, and even at a small and incremental way, the income inequalities between classes, because the more we can build solidarity, the more we can demonstrate that solidarity wins for working class people, the more we can entrench a key factor in building the case for socialism, which is trust between human beings, and the belief that human beings, when acting in concert, can make the world a better and more just place. So the grave implications for us, but also very, very sharply argued and evidenced data against the dysfunctionality of capitalist societies and income inequalities in particular.
Thank you, Mike. We should bring in Chris now.
Okay, so let me introduce Chris, actually. I mean, Chris Knight, Professor Chris Knight, might be well known to many of us. Well, he should be, because he's an extremely well-known academic and a political activist as well. And I must mention here too that he's actually the founder of, I think it's the oldest evening class in the country. It's called the Radical Anthropology Group. And if you want something to do on a Tuesday night, whether you can get there or whether you can only do it on Skype, if you want some real basic, fascinating insight on what it means to be human and how we become human, you should all tune in on that. But he's also been interested in the development of language and symbolic cultures, and him and Chomsky have been having quite a set to. He's written a number of books, you know, one most recent one was a kind of critique on Chomsky, but the one that I read the most was called Blood Relations, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture. So he's our man to talk about this tonight. And I want to start first, Chris, by asking you, is it a coincidence that Marx and Engels were anthropologists?
A coincidence. Well, there's no doubt that they were doing what we would now call anthropology. I mean, it's absolutely no question. They were not economists. Marx says Capital was a critique of political economy. Particularly this is clear in the early writings of Marx and Engels. They were interested in what it means to be human. And they instinctively knew that to be human is to enjoy fulfilling the needs of others. I mean, you gain pleasure from giving others pleasure. We are intrinsically social creatures. And they knew all about how class society had increasingly, while developing technology and forces of production, and increasingly intensified exploitation and suffering. And so, yes, they were definitely anthropologists. And it's not a coincidence, because as soon as you start chopping up science into these different, incommensurable subdisciplines, you have geography, history, psychology, whatever it is, evolution, and they're all in little bits not talking to each other. Then, of course, you're losing the plot completely. And the point about Marxism was not to have a particular discipline. They weren't saying, oh, Marxism is one more of these things called science. They were saying, join up the big picture. We need young people, and everybody, all of us need to put the big picture together. And as soon as you do that, well, that's what we call anthropology, because anthropology, although it's the study of what it means to be human, it absolutely is the study of how we came to be human. And so it immediately links up with primatology, geology, all the different climate crises and extinctions throughout the evolution of life on Earth. So it's anthropology is where it all meets up, and we need to connect. We need to connect. And that's what Marx and Engels did better than anyone in their time, and it's what we need to do in the light of current knowledge, and not just keep on parroting sort of in kind of slogans, things which you think Marx and Engels said in their own time. I mean, they wouldn't, if they were alive today, they would be keeping up to date with all the most cutting edge science concerning this critical question: what does it mean to be human? How many different ways are there of being human? Is the way we do it in the West, is that the only way? Is bringing up kids with one mummy and one daddy who probably separate at some point in their lives, is that the only way of bringing up children? All these questions were absolutely central. And in a way, the tragedy was that poor old Marx, he didn't even finish volume 1. He didn't finish what he called the shit. He didn't get to all the things he meant to get to, because of course none of us live long enough.
So I mean, it's not surprising then that these two guys working together end up, because they're interested, they're drawn to understand, to try and understand what makes humans, that they develop what we now understand as sort of Marxism. Now, as part of Marxism, there is this concept developed, isn't there, Chris, of alienation. And I think, to me, alienation really does lie at the bottom of what it means to live in a capitalist society today. So can you explain to us, please, alienation?
Well, I mean, what Marx and Engels, particularly in their early writings, meant was that to be human, is to live in a world where meeting the needs of those around us and getting pleasure from that through production. It can be production of singing, it can be production of, it doesn't have to be objects, but generally producing one another. And what they're saying is that doing that in order to enjoy it, because is needed labor, if you like. And as soon as you have to do these things, we have to produce simply in order to get the money to keep body and soul together, to pay for this, to mend the ceiling, to stop the rain coming through, to generally survive. Marx and Engels describe that as the deepest of paradoxes. And I don't know if you want me to read out some of these things, but they're saying, supposing, it is from the Paris manuscript, supposing that we had produced in a human manner, each of us would, in his production, have doubly affirmed to himself. In your enjoyment of my product, this is their own words, I would have had the direct enjoyment of realizing that I satisfied your need by my work. And they go on through this, just saying that in a way that, and they're quite explicit about this. They get to the point where they use a kind of tabooed word, which scientists aren't supposed to use, but they do. They use the word love. In my expression of my life, I would have fashioned your expression of your life, and thus in my own activity, I've realized my own essence. And if you don't kind of censor some of these writings, you'll immediately come across the following passage. The immediate, natural, and necessary relation of human being to human being is also the relationship of man to woman. And I won't go through the whole quote, but as soon as you think about that, they're saying, well, in sexual relationships, your enjoyment is giving enjoyment to your partner. It's kind of a no-brainer. And if you had to do sex in order to keep, a roof over your head, well, we would call that prostitution. And it's a complete topsy-turvy thing where you're doing what's most social in order to simply satisfy a biological need. And then they went on to talk about prostitution, because they're very interested in sex and the different ways there are of enjoying sexual relationships. And they said of wage slavery, they say sexual prostitution is a specific expression of prostitution, and they described prostitution in terms of wage slavery. They were saying, if you have to do it for money instead of for love, whichever kind of production it is, it's a supreme paradox. And I mean, I won't go on, but as soon as you think in the way they did in those early writings, it just seems a complete no-brainer that the meaning of your life is in giving meaning and joy and pleasure to those around you. And if you're unable to do that, if you're just, that little clip we had at the beginning, if you've just got sort of affluence, you're just feeding yourself and somehow keeping your body alive, no wonder that all meaning in life disappears. And as we heard in that little clip, there isn't a pill to give you back meaning in your life. There's no pill that can do that.
Chris, could we sort of talk about the specifics of alienation within capitalism? Because alienation has existed in class society, all class societies before capitalism. But Marx and Engels in the notebooks, in the manuscript, sorry, they make a specific case that capitalism brings this alienation to the fore. And if the 4 points, and I know you think there should be sex in there as well, but it does within capitalism, the alienation from work is much more pronounced than it has been in feudalism, for example, when peasants were still on their own land, were doing their thing, still in a class society. But capitalism goes one further, doesn't it? It makes you produce things that you have no control over the things you produce. You have no control over how it's being produced. You are forced to sell your labor power, not because to make yourself into a rounded human being, but you have to earn a living. You have to sell your labor power to survive, not to fulfill any desires or dreams or wishes you have about what you would want to do with your work and and how you work, and that alienates you from other people. How do you see the way that capitalism takes that further than any other society?
Well, Tina, I mean, I'm not a specialist in that area. It's not my field of study. I can talk about it if you like, but what I say won't be. I don't think will be any more profound than what other Marxists can say. But I would just say kind of briefly. I mean, my problem with those 4 points is that they're full. And I'm simply saying that you could add another one, alienation in sex, and I don't know. You can carry on making 4, 5, 6, 7, and my point isn't that really. It's that they're one thing. That the nature of humans is to enjoy giving pleasure to each other. That's a rather special thing as humans. We produce each other, and we produce each other in terms of reproduction, of course. And we produce each other in terms of production, and enjoying that social activity is what we are used to. But Tina, what I'd rather do is come from the background of my specialism. I don't think you can understand capitalist alienation without seeing its opposite. We have to see what, like Marx and Engels were saying, what would it look like if we weren't alienated? What kind of world would we live in? And I'll just say really briefly, just in case it leaves anywhere else. It was, I think, about 2004, and I was about half a mile away from a Hadza camp. Some of you may know about the Hadza in Tanzania. They're the last hunter-gathering people who, to this day, live by bow and arrow hunting relatively large game, zebra and other large animals. And talking about the spirit level and the way in which egalitarian societies, more equal societies have lower rates of depression and misery and so on. African, what we call immediate return hunter-gatherers, are the most equal societies there have ever been. When I say immediate return, I mean hunter-gatherers who don't practice storage. When you start getting storage, they start to get unequal. And I'll simply say this, I was about half a mile away coming towards this camp, and the sound I could hear was laughter. You just heard laughter, laughter, laughter. Partly it was the kids having a whale of a time, but soon you realize it wasn't just the kids. Laughter and singing. While the women are working, they're singing pretty much all the time. It's just normal to be singing together, normal to be laughing together. And if I simply say, laughter is the best medicine, it's the way you get over problems, laughing, having a good laugh together about it. And singing is, of course, a wonderful way of bonding. Now, I mean, I could go on, but I simply want to say, if we've got no knowledge of a way of life where laughter and singing and all that joy and producing for each other is kind of normal, I don't think we can get a perspective on capitalist alienation. So I'm not too keen on Chris Knight telling you all about capitalist alienation, because, as I say, I can't say anything more intelligent about that than nearly everyone else in this room. I'm an anthropologist and I like to put things together.
Can I just say, because I've noticed a lot of the comments, and I think what we have is we're kind of blinded by our own time. So people in the chat are talking about, you know, the fact that alienation happened before capitalism, you know, in feudalism and etc. Those periods of human history are a blink on the expanse of human history. For most of the time, human beings were not in feudal organizations. They weren't living in cities. They were living as hunter-gatherers. That's what their lives were. And if you like, that was the natural way of being a human being. So when Engels and Marx are thinking about it, or as an anthropologist, when you're thinking about this, what you're trying to conceive of is starting from base one and saying, what would it be to imagine a society where we were living in a way that we should be living to get the most out of life? Once we've done that, then we can build from there. But forget feudalism. You know, feudalism had lords. You know, it had lords and masters and people who would come in and, you know, tell you what to do, like the clergy. These are just very, very recent human developments. And I think what we must all do as Marxists, those of us who are, is make that mental leap that Marx and Engels made to enable them to develop the theories they do and to actually think, what does it mean to be human? And especially, you know, I mean, even to talk about feudalism is so Eurocentric. Feudalism, what does that mean if you've been living in Africa, for goodness sake? It means nothing. So let's just, you know, get out of this a little bit.
Can I build on by saying that a discipline very closely related to mine, I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, but there's a discipline called evolutionary psychology, which has got various problems, some of it, but it's in general very interesting. And what the evolutionary psychologists say is that our nature has been forged through around 1 million years, maybe 500,000 years of living in egalitarian societies where you could laugh at each other, play with each other, sing together, and no one could tell you what to do. No one person could tell another person what to do. Now we've evolved under circumstances where that's just part of our instincts, it's part of our nature. We feel happiest under conditions where A, no one's bossing us, and B, we don't have to boss other people. And the evolutionary psychologists, this is just mainstream stuff for creatures like us, so constructed by what you might call Darwinian selection pressure to live in an egalitarian society. When we find ourselves having to cope with a boss, when we find ourselves having to cope with people, it's very hard to have a really good laugh with your boss. It's very, very hard to have a really good laugh with people you're supposed to be in control of. And all of us know that to have a good laugh and to really feel happy and healthy, what do? We go to work, whatever kind of framework it is. For a lot of us, of course, in this country, it's off to the pub where you're with your mates and you can have a good old laugh about things and share things and trust each other. So I'm just saying, mainstream evolutionary psychology attributes a large number of the stresses and strains and illnesses that we're suffering from now to the fact that we're like fish out of water. We've been removed from our natural environment, which is an egalitarian social matrix, and put into forms of social hierarchy to which we're just allergic. Now, if we were chimpanzees, common chimpanzees, that would be different. Common chimpanzees, the sort of famous chimpanzees, they're by no means egalitarian. They're hugely hierarchical. There's constant fights and threats. The males are constantly looking for sex with the female. There's horrible hierarchies. They're kind of used to hierarchy. And there used to be sort of dominance and submission relationships. We got out of all that. We turned the world upside down. We became egalitarian in an extraordinary process of what's called the human revolution. And we're completely, I don't know, not just our minds, but our bodies are just puzzled by this capitalist framework. It's not this unequal framework in which we find ourselves these days.
So can I just ask just one more thing from there, and then I think Tina wants to come in. So let's just take it to, traditional societies, hunter-gatherers. I mean, was there depression? When you go to the Hadza, do the Hadza sit there and go, oh, I can't get out of bed today and hunt because I'm just feeling so depressed? Does that happen? Because, I'm reading the chat and there's a lot of people saying, yes, but, okay, there is some socially constructed depression, but then there is depression. Like, is there this thing, this kind of chemical thing called depression? And if there is, how would the Hadza deal with it?
Well, before I came on, I thought I'd ring up my colleague Jerome Lewis, who has been on this program before several months ago, and he's probably the world expert on this. He's done fieldwork among egalitarian African hunter-gatherers over a period of 20 years. And he was interested because he tells me, Chris, there's been remarkably little study comparing rates of mental depression, mental problems among hunter-gatherers compared with people in other societies. It's not very well established, but he can certainly say that yes, there are people who are maybe a little bit strange, but there's an extraordinary amount of tolerance in the societies he studies. And what happens? I mean, his basic field is with these people called the Benjeli of the Congo rainforest. And he will tell you that as soon as they've been settled, so as soon as either the development agencies or the logging companies cutting down the trees or whatever has forced them to settle, once settled, there's no singing. All that stops. The first thing to happen is that everyone gets drunk because people are selling them alcohol. And then the next thing to happen is that there are lots of fights. Now, to sort of try to answer the question of, do they have depression? I think Jerome would say some people are, less happy than others sometimes, but then immediately everyone just feels an instinctive need to come to their aid and to help and to cheer them up if that is happening. So when I heard somebody saying on the chat, I saw in the chat, bring back R.D. Laing, and I just wanted to sort of mention that I was a huge fan of R.D. Laing, and I read about himself and those other things, but I came to realize afterwards that actually there were very big problems with that, because it meant that any time parents had a child with some degree of autism, it was their fault. They must have brought up the kid wrong. And the fact is, there are, as we heard from Bob just a moment ago, there are some genetic components of that. And so Jerome would definitely say sometimes in a population of hunter-gatherers, you will get somebody who's kind of on the spectrum for those genetic reasons. But the point is, they won't be put in an asylum. They won't be. There will be, and of course, the other thing Jerome says, which again I've sort of known, is that people who have hallucinations and visions and everything else, so they're very often valued. They're the people who see furthest ahead. They could be the shamans. They can be the prophets. They can be. There's a huge value in all that sort of thing. So I mean, it is, as Jerome said, it is kind of noticeable and in some ways a scandal that these egalitarian hunter-gatherers, and by the way, they're gender egalitarian, the women have enormous amounts of solidarity and pretty much run everything. Those societies, they're kind of ignored by the people who make cross-cultural comparisons on rates of illness and depression and suicide and so on, and they shouldn't be. Jerome tells me I don't think he's ever come across a suicide for those reasons. As far as I know, of course, people I think are saying on the chat that there's all sorts of things wrong. I suppose the main thing wrong with hunter-gatherers is they don't have modern medicine. Is that something wrong with them? Can we say the trouble is you don't have hospitals and operations and all that stuff? I mean, it slightly reminds me of people that sort of, try to, like Margaret Thatcher, try to get rid of working class solidarity by saying, oh, you can have your own house and you can sort of try to bribe people. The hunter-gatherers that we know have no intention of exchanging their way of life, even if it does mean that you can get to a hospital. Clearly, sometimes they do go to a hospital, but I mean, the point is, in the past, somebody who falls out of a tree and breaks a leg or something, they will be absolutely loved. It's probably true they won't have a leg amputation and be given a new leg and things, but I just think those levels of comparison of hunter-gatherers and people in modern Western society they're just inappropriate, to be honest, because the critical thing is the quality of life and the quality of care you get when you are ill. Not no one wants to say that modern medicine isn't great, and increasingly hunter-gatherers, of course, do have access to modern medicine when they're seriously ill, and that's a good thing. But kind of putting a sort of moral value on that is deeply inappropriate in my view.
It's really interesting looking back because it tells us about what we can look forward to, what we're striving to, overcome capitalism. We need to replace it with something. And I think, well, we can't go back in time. Obviously, there's certainly a lot of things to learn from previous societies. Can I talk to you about sort of, the lack of control that we have in, within capitalism and the way things are being produced, and we're, wage slaves, etc. I think a lack of control over how we live and how you have to earn your living, what makes a lot of people very, ill, as well as, depressed, etc., which is also then reflected in the invention of a sort of leisure industry, which is almost like, you have to go to work, you do your, the boss tells you what to do, you have to do it, you have no control over it. Then leisure is supposed to become the thing where you become human and where you can do your, fulfill your needs, etc. But then you look around, and what most people do as leisure these days is zilch, watch Netflix, just try to come down from the totally alienated way of work. So they don't fulfill themselves at work, they don't fulfill themselves outside of work, because they're shattered from having to work 9, 10 hours a day. Does the division between sort of leisure and work, does that exist in the communities you've studied?
That's such a good question. Okay. When very rich people, when the royals and various other people, want to go on a holiday, what do? They at least traditionally, of course, they would go hunting. They go to Africa somewhere, they go on safari, and they'd shoot lions or zebras or something. And that's their idea of the absolute, the most wonderful thing you can do, which is to kind of go back in some ways to hunting and gathering, because you're hunting jeeps and heavy weaponry, which doesn't make it the same. But when I was talking to the Hadza, they just say, well, we do that every day of the week. We're always hunting. We're doing what your rich people do for a week or two, huge cost, and it's our way of life. But on the question of control, it's so clear that the hunting they do is done for pleasure. It's not labor. It's obviously, going hunting with a bow and arrow. It's challenging, but it's sport. It's pleasurable, And all the arrangements around the hunting, all the getting the men to go hunting, which the women basically do, all the bringing back the meat and everything else, all the rituals around it. Again, Marxists often don't understand this concept of ritual. It just means all the communal celebrations which are needed to motivate the hunt and bring back the meat and make sure it's all distributed. Essentially, they amount to it correspond to a word which, again, we don't connect up with production, and that word is play. Everything's playful, one way or another. Play is the governing principle of life. And my own view, from what I know and from the experience I've had being with the Hadza for a relatively short time, is that, I don't know, everything's together. I mean, okay, let's just say hunter-gatherers don't have religion, because they know that when people do religion, it's play. It's what children do when they're little, which is let's pretend. And when you get to being adults, you do it sort of, you do your let's pretend in an adult way, which Westerners call religion. But the word that Benjeli have for play is masana, and it's the same. They use the same word for when adults do play, which we would call religion, and when children are playful. So everything's playful. And the take-home message from this is that if you've forgotten how to play, and that applies to me, to you, to everyone listening here. If you've forgotten how to play, you have forgotten the meaning of life. You've forgotten the meaning of life. Play is it. It's the governing principle of everything. It's part of laughter. It's part of kinship. It's part of all the different things people do. Somehow it's all playful. And the reason it can be playful is because people are in control. You know, there's nobody telling you what to do. There's no mystical thing called the economy. In terms of hunting, the Hadza have basically a kind of lunar rhythm. Every dark moon, they have their marvelous ritual called Epime, when everyone's constructed as kind of sisters and brothers. There's no sex. There's a huge amount of solidarity, and you build up and build up and build up until around full moon. And in the past, this would have been during the dry season. Around full moon, the men would go what's called nightstand hunting. They built a blind next to a water hole where the animals come to drink. And they hunt the animals from just a few yards away, but a thing which they could only do at full moon. So they have this really slow clock, a sort of waxing and waning moon. Each time they hunt successful, they've got enough meat to last quite a few weeks, and they're in control of that. They can look into the future, not that far into the future. They're not interested in the next 50, 100 years any more than they're too interested in doing sort of paleontology and going back millions of years. But they're interested in the future, and they've got control over that future. And even if it's only a relatively short period in our sort of chronological terms, but they're in control of it. They're in control of their lives, and everything is kind of joyful, wrapped up in play and song. Everyone knows why they're bringing back the animals. It's all just the animals, of course, distributed and cooked and shared around in a very egalitarian way. And so that problem, Tina, of loss of control, feeling helpless, feeling out of control, feeling that alien forces are kind of dominating your life and you can't understand, what is this thing called the economy? Absolutely, hunters and gatherers don't have that. And as we were evolving as humans, we were never subjected to that experience of being completely out of control.
So, Chris, I mean, I have to tell you, I've been just writing odd things down as you've been speaking, because I don't know about everybody else, but this year has been total utter shite as far as I'm concerned. Politically, I felt like the end, not that the end is coming, but that we're living through the end of days. It's been very hard at times to feel optimistic. And as you were speaking, I wrote down dancing, fast, repetitive music, and I was thinking of the fact that the time this year when I felt at my happiest was going to a festival where I spent 3 days dancing. Now, not everybody can do that. Not everybody can take control of their time. And also what we've got to think about is, as socialists, we're trying to move things on in a collective manner. How do we then not just think about the time before, when as human beings we were happier, to be with each other and to be with ourselves. What does it mean for what we need to aspire to, and how can we kind of put that into our political practice?
Well, I mean, obviously I can't sort of tell everyone what the answers are exactly, but I mean, I'll say for me, all human culture, kinship, language, solidarity, religion, everything about us that makes us human was born on something like the picket line, because women had to get together and make quite clear to the opposite sex that if they wanted any sexual enjoyment, the men better behave and make themselves useful. And one of the ways that men can make themselves useful is to go out to the hunt and make sure they bring back the meat. So I've always known that this process of women's solidarity and resistance to any kind of male harassment was the root of human society. Therefore, every time I've been on a picket line, what I've experienced has been an extraordinary level of solidarity, lots of laughter, lots of fun on picket lines, all of us meeting up from different departments. If it's a college, I used to be a postman, so the same thing would happen. And so my answer would be, bring the laughter, bring the music, bring the repetitive beats to the picket line, and make the picket line infectious, make it fun, make it sort of irresistible, so that picket lines. I mean, what happened in the 90s, 1905, 6, 7, with the Dockers international strike? It's the longest strike ever in history, lasted 2 years. It was an international strike. We stopped just about all the ports around the world for a week in 1997. What happened was that strike was backed up by Reclaim the Streets, and the repetitive beats crowd, the campaign against Thatcher's laws banning repetitive beats. And we had a melting of all those different elements, which led, of course, to things like Seattle and so on, when you had these huge uprisings, which linked trade union activism with climate activism and protection of wildlife and so forth. So if there is a solution, which it is a bit late, it's to make sure that pickets are supported. And there's no question in my mind that the way to do them is something like, I mean, we did this in the miners' strike in 1984, the particular strike that I helped organize with what we had then, which was the Mine Workers Defence Committee, when actually it was the only, I'm quite proud of this, it was the only time we actually closed down a whole power station for a whole day. It was the Neasden power station. And we made it very clear in advance to the police and everyone else, this is going to be a very unusual picket, because we're going to have fire eaters, jugglers, singers, music, dancing on that picket line. And of course, the company, under advice from the police, just said, we'll call it a day. Don't even try to bring anything across. We did something very similar with the Liverpool Dockers, where we brought lots of drumming and music and so on to their picket lines. So that's the way to join things up, to join up the idea of play, of fun, of dance, and everything that makes life joyful with being on a picket line.
Thank you, Chris. I think it's very important when we're talking about, trying to strive for a different society, that we understand that capitalism is not natural at all. It's a very, very new phenomena as class society, but capitalism in particular is a very recent, a few hundred years, if that. And before that, I'm just reading a really interesting book by Rosa Luxemburg that I think you reviewed as well. She went back a few hundred years and saw examples of what she called Urkommunismus, which was still existing then within, next to the emergence of capitalism, where societies organized collectively. They had, there were no real hierarchies. They divided everything up. Nobody went hungry. Everybody, worked together and shared together. And that wasn't so much, the primitive communism of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, but 400 or 500 years ago, if that. So it is, it is a very recent phenomenon, capitalism, and it's something that's not natural and something we can overcome. And I do like, the idea of, obviously, of control and you being able to fulfill yourself through work. Work shouldn't be something that you have to slog away at, don't enjoy at all. You're just doing it for money. But as Marx described it, you could be a fisherman in the morning, a cobbler in the afternoon, in the evening you write a novel, you go to the theater, you can express and try out all sorts of things, because we're organizing society in a totally different way. And the idea of play and fun in that is so hugely important. So I think it's really good to have you here to discuss some of these issues. We're going to have another show next week where we're going to look at other aspects of that whole issue of mental health, craziness, whatever. But we want to give comrades a chance now to also come in, ask questions or make short contributions. Chris is hopefully staying with us to the end of the show in case there are questions directed at you. Jane, you were first to have your hand up. Come in, please. I think we're also seeing you next week, Jane. So don't say anything you're going to say next week. You're still muted. Can you try to unmute yourself? Still muted, I'm afraid. I'm going to ask you again. You should say on your screen if you press a button there. No, still muted. I'm going to bring in Jenny in the meantime. Perhaps you can try and sort it out in the meantime. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, I just want to bring in an element of what happens diagnostically when we're talking about mental health, just from my experiences. And I just want to give you 3 examples of how it happens on the ground and how sometimes labeling and diagnosis can be used to oppress and sort of marginalize people. Oh, what's happened? And
Echo, sorry.
Is that my echo?
I think it was actually Jane, so I've muted.
Okay, all right.
Sorry,
So
Jane.
I'll give you some 3 examples. I was a social worker, and part of my job was actually being involved in the whole process of sectioning people and stuff like that. But when I was a trainee social worker, I was sent out to see an old man who people thought was probably mentally ill, because no matter what anybody said to him, and he was otherwise compos mentis, but he would not pay his electricity bill or his milk bill, and it was driving people around the bend, right? So out I went and had a chat with him, and what it emerged was that he was a very active trade unionist in his younger life, and he went on a trade union trip to Russia. And what he remembered from that trip, this is going back many, many years, what he remembered from that trip was that old people didn't have to pay anything for their electricity, for their fuel, or for their milk. So as he reached old age, he decided he wasn't going to either. It was his sign of protest. Right, and he showed me a load of photographs of where he'd been and everything like that, and I went away and thought, yeah, carry on, you know. But he was described as being possibly mentally ill, because his brain wasn't functioning in the way that other people thought it ought to. That was the first example. I've got 2 examples of women who were being abused by their partners. One where it was a South Asian woman who couldn't speak any English, and the psychiatrist was there to section her, and my job as a social worker was to sign off the other half of that sectioning. But she couldn't speak a word of English, so I refused to do so. So I had to come back with an interpreter, and it turned out that her husband was abusing her, and so she'd hit him over the head with a frying pan, which seemed perfectly normal to me, and therefore not sectionable, right? But it was just another way of oppressing and marginalizing people through diagnosis. There was a similar situation with a woman who did speak English, and I could see from the minute I started that in fact the problem was domestic violence, not her mental health. The final one was a young teenager who we'd had some dealing with when she was sort of 14 or 15, and suspected that she'd been serially sexually abused by her father, but she could never bring herself to say it. She re-emerged back 3 years later, and she'd been diagnosed with a personality disorder. And this was meant to be the explanation about why she had called her mental health counsellor, why she had accused him of sexually abusing her. And as a result of that, the Mental Health Trust did absolutely nothing to help her. And it was only when she managed to get support from a local solicitor and myself actually to go and report that to the police. And there was a big investigation afterwards about why the Mental Health Trust had not investigated her. They had merely labelled her as somebody with a serious personality disorder, not thinking that it might actually have a good reason, you know, to be accusing that person. And then finally, just as a quick aside, also as a trainee social worker, I worked in a hospital. I went on a placement in a mental health hospital called John Connolly in Birmingham, and they were a very forward-looking hospital. So the staff didn't wear uniforms. Everybody wore the same clothes. And I have to be honest with you, the only way I could tell a difference between the patients and the doctors was which one was wearing slippers. Because in terms of the rest of it, I saw some very, you know, unusual behavior, let's say that. I couldn't tell the difference. And I just think it's important to bring out that how diagnosing and labeling people can be also used to oppress people and to marginalize difference, and that's really important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. Okay, comrades, we only have about 20 minutes, so if you could just keep to a couple of minutes each, that would be appreciated. Jane, shall we try you again?
I'm muted.
Yeah, it's very bad audio, actually. I think your internet isn't great. If I turn off your camera, can you try then, perhaps?
All right. Can you hear me better?
Try now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, 3 points. First is, I was going to say a little bit early Marx on alienation. It's all been covered, but we're not a Marxist think tank. So I want to come down to capitalism. Marx was very perceptive to understand that in a form of capitalism, that it doesn't eat the soul or guts the way corporate neoliberalism does now. So that's very interesting. And what's the 2 points? I have toxic society. We live in a toxic society. I'm not going to get into semantics. I'm in the head trade, in the addiction field for 40 years. We'll get to that down the road. But if you say you have cancer, you get sympathy. You got a mental health diagnosis, they don't want to know. So going back, the bifurcation in Western science and Western medicines between mind and body is ridiculous. So what do the hunter and gatherers have that we draw into now? Community, interconnectedness, and the way they raise their kids. They don't sit time out on a chair. They don't go in a room because they're acting out. The way we raise our kids is very capitalist. And the point I want to make from being in the head trade is kids develop from the womb onwards interrelationally to be human through first the womb to the primary caregiver or the care system, and you develop a self. And in capitalist society, the poor, unlike the soccer moms, don't have the time to do the kind of investment. So that's just one piece. But hunter and gatherers, the kids were cared for in a community, and there was that interrelationship. Alienation is massive now, and we blame ourselves for why aren't I coping? Why can't I pay my rent? So stress pours the cortisol down. So going back to about the hunter and gatherers, and then just briefly, what do I want to say? Yeah, they use a lot of plant medicine. We'll get into that down the road. And it's generational, not so much genetic. And I think the way you are raised in poverty and you are impoverished internally and externally, you don't develop your kids as well as soccer mom who gives them all the time. There's a whole lot of things there in the way poverty disenfranchises it. You know at 5 when you hit school and your coat's too big because of your cousins and your shoes are too small, that you're lesser than the kid who goes on holiday somewhere abroad. So you start with that. up to the trauma and all the other stuff we're going to get to down the road. It's generational, and we push it to genetic. A lot of it is the interaction to be human and how we survive in such a society. Stress floods us with cortisol. So you got two things, parasympathetic and sympathetic. We run on fight and flight. We're busy, we're up, we're on it. Our rest and relax. And when you have trauma and all the other stuff you get down the road to, you need mood altering legal prescription and illegal drugs to chill out the craziness, or whatever you want to call it. So that's it. And we'll get down to where it goes to my field. But I felt it was important to say that between mental and physical health, we haven't connected, that they're integrated. Yeah. And I think in the hunter and gatherer societies, they had something going besides not having capitalism that helped the development of people in that society. That's it.
Thank you, Jane. We'll be hearing more from Jane next week in next week's show. So this is a little teaser for the next week's show. Thank you for joining us. Tony had his hand up. Well, didn't know how to put his hand up, so I'm bringing him briefly now. Hi, Tony.
Yeah, thank you.
3 minutes if you can.
Yes, of course. It's been an interesting discussion. I mean, firstly, I don't think we should over-glorify hunter-gatherer societies. People froze at night, they didn't have enough food often, etc., etc. I mean, there are great advantages to technological advancements. It's the way that capitalism distributes those advantages. But on the question of mental health, it comes under, it's basically not one single phenomena. To misquote R.D. Laing, society fucks you up, and that does. And the majority of mental illness, to one degree or another, is undoubtedly caused by society. But I do know from looking after, from having an autistic son, that it's not just society. Without a doubt. I mean, you know, Daniel has for 5 years been absolutely free of aggression and so on. But he took an antibiotic recently, which interfered with those drugs. And yesterday, he hit a woman for no reason at all in the street. Now, I think that's crazy behavior. And yes, I do use the word crazy. I don't have any problem with it. It just does describe aberrant, or if you like, sociopathic behavior at times. And we shouldn't be afraid of that. I also say that this is one of the faults of the women's movement. You concentrate on the language and you actually ignore the problem itself. Changing your language does not change society. It reflects society. So we should not be, if you like, go down that particular pathway. But I ask myself, why did Daniel become autistic? It may well be environmental. The fact that autism is increasing, it's nearly 1% in America. Obviously, I think there are environmental problems. But the fact is that once someone is autistic, how do you deal with the behavior that most of us would say is not in accordance with our own norms? And you have to deal with it medically. And you may say, well, that's wrong. But the fact is that when you're a parent who's being attacked by your child, you have to have some way of being able to deal with it other than physically having to overcome them. So I would say don't just bracket all mental health conditions under one label, because that simply doesn't work out in practice. Thank you.
Can I say, Tony, I actually agree with almost everything you say. And I think you're very knowledgeable about most things, but you're not knowledgeable about hunter-gatherers. If you look at all the evidence, they weren't shivering and starving. And, you know, it wasn't, and I'm quoting here from people, grueling and relentless. They spend most of their time playing and singing. That's what they do. They spend about 15 hours a week, what we would think of as work, which they think of as play.
Jackie, is that all hunter-gatherer societies?
Wait.
Can I come in briefly just to say, Jerome told me that they believe that anyone in the world could be starving. The idea of starvation is just incomprehensible to them. Exactly. They live a life of not just abundance, but superabundance. They have a far better diet than anyone in the West has, extraordinary different types of honey and game animals and so on. So it's and the idea we evolved in Africa, Tony, and you know, if you can talk about Inuit people in the Arctic getting a bit cold with. But I mean, we evolved in Africa, and the idea, the two things you mentioned, freezing to death with cold and starving, are just show. I'm sorry, Tony, but as Jackie said, you're very knowledgeable about lots of things. You're unfortunately, I have to use the word, ignorant about hunter-gatherers.
I also think, you know, the problem is when you've had so much of this kind of Eurocentric propaganda about what these societies were, that's what comes into people's heads. Biafra comes into people's head. Hunter-gatherers were not like that.
Okay, we're going to shut Tony up before he comes back. Marion, I know your video is not working.
Yeah, the first thing I want to say is language is important, and while I might not think about crazy, words like lunatic, spastic, and those kind of words, ableist words that demonize people with mental health issues is disgraceful and disgusting, and I object to that. Language is important. The second thing I want to say is, I think we also have to look at how do we, as socialists, try and remove some of the barriers that people with disabilities experience in their day-to-day life. And that's very important. And I also have Anthony's on the autism spectrum. And, you know, there are some real issues. And there's a real lack of support out there. Luckily in Birmingham, Mind has taken over some of the services and does give quite a lot of support. And medication is important because one of the people that goes to Mind, he worked in a solicitor's office and people removed his medication. He then had a breakdown. Then he lost his job. They didn't give him tablets. He had problems. They mucked around with his social security and things like that. And that man's had a load of problems until he reached retirement age. So these things are quite important. And the number of people with disabilities that have killed themselves because of the benefit system is on record. And we need to be doing something about that. And I think it's important that we look at the kind of demands, immediate demands and intermediate demands that we can try and pose to improve things for people. And it's a big issue. It's a big issue for me because it's very difficult. And I accept alienation and a lot of the problems that people experience are because of the conditioning. My own sister, it happened to. You know, when she was a young mother with 2 children and she was experiencing all kinds of difficulties financially and all sorts, and they were going to give her ECT. They were going to bloody fry her brain. And I said, don't do it. What you're feeling, anybody in your situation would be feeling that. If you're not feeling what you're feeling, then I'd say there was something wrong with you. So that exists as well. But we also have to do something now to fight for that better world we're trying to fight for. And people with disabilities, and that includes mental difficulties, need that support. And there's a lack of support. Yes, there can be misdiagnosis and all that as well, but sometimes medication is needed, and we shouldn't poo-poo that. Yeah, because that enables people then to function and do things. So you know we can't have a rose spectacle, put our rose glasses on. We've got to look at sometimes the world as it actually is. But for me, the key thing is how do we fight to remove the barriers that exist, because that is a part of our struggle for socialism.
Thank you, Marion. Sorry to rush along. There's quite a few comrades who want to speak on this. I would ask you to keep it short, please, if you could. Jim, please. You need to unmute yourself. There should be something on your screen.
How's that now? Thank you, Jay. I think we should look at the cooperative, in fact, movement. If you look in Spain, here, there's actually two cities there. One where the main business is cooperative business, and the other area nearby is a capitalist business. And you find that the ones who have the cooperative businesses, they produce, there's less unemployment here, that the kids at school attainment, in fact, levels are better, and there's less like violence, etc. Less people going to prison. So it's a cooperative act. People who work together and actually, can achieve more. There's about 1.2 billion cooperative members in the world. There's about 3 million businesses, and that supports it there. So I've just got this wee map. I don't know if you can see it well at all, but that's the world. That's the cooperative world here. So you might be able to see that. How businesses come together. So people will actually, get involved, have more cooperative businesses. They could all join together. One point, and actually, defeat capitalism. You used to talk about the cooperative, in fact, Commonwealth. That's another issue to go there. So I think we should, look at that area, how people can actually form cooperative businesses more and develop it from there. I won't go on any further, Chair, but thanks for your.
Thank you. Ian, please.
Good evening, comrades. Just a couple of points. First of all, in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, and also in the Communist Manifesto, Marx is at pains to point out that it's actually abundance is a prerequisite, in a sense, for a fully developed human society. He talks about labour becoming man's prime want. I mean, I've never wanted to go to work in my life, but of course, that doesn't mean to say if I didn't have to go to work, I would just do nothing. Of course, we would do all sorts of things that are creative, but there's the prerequisite for that is that you have abundance. And the whole point about what Marx's work was about was an ontological one. You actually change humans to become truly human for the first time in their history. But no one wants to go back to being a hunter-gatherer. No one wants to go back to feudalism or go back to anything. We want to go forward to a society where labour does become genuinely creative. Of course, as consistent materialists as well, I think we also have to say that, as somebody else already made this point, that the distinction between mental and physical illness is nonsense. There is only matter. Mind events are brain events, and I appreciate it's more complicated than that, and we could go on about that. But let's just take one simple thing. I've been a mental health nurse for 40 years, and I've worked with people with personality disorders, and quite often you get people who use terms like psychopath or whatever else, and it becomes very pejorative. And the idea that somehow they're just not nice people. If you look at more recent scientific investigations, you can actually see, for example, on a positron emission tomography, that the frontal lobes in people with some personality disorders are relatively inactive. Now that opens up, for me, something which is hugely optimistic. You could potentially intervene in such a way, not just by drugs, but by exercises of one sort or another, or psychotherapy, of actually enlivening, as it were, those underactive areas. It's important to approach it scientifically. And a couple of other little things. Just a point about R.D. Laing. I once asked his son, I spoke to him in Glasgow, what were your dad's politics? And he said he was a reactionary against the status quo. So Laing had insights, but generally speaking, most of his stuff is completely incoherent. Along with many of the so-called anti-psychiatry school are completely disparate. Thomas Sapps, for example, was on the far right, and his concern there was really with the state interfering in people's individual liberty. Well, look, if you've got dementia, or if you've got depression or whatever, are you saying that the same rules just simply apply to you? I mean, my feeling is, if you like the terms like madness or crazy, try phoning in sick one day with that. I'm not coming into work today because I'm mad. The popularity of using terms like madness or crazy or whatever was originally to get away from positivistic medical science, or something. It was very much popularized by R.D. Laing. He popularized Foucault to an English-speaking audience, and he knew him personally. I know that because I've read his correspondence. And Foucault, as you know, it was part of that whole school that moved away from the idea of a materialist understanding of the history of humanity. And R.D. Laing jumped on any old bandwagon. Foucault's history of psychiatry was Histoire de la folie. Now, I would translate that as a history of insanity or something like that. But of course, it came translated as madness and civilization. Now it's become terribly fashionable to call it madness. No, madness is pejorative. I appreciate there's a common usage of crazy, which I don't find offensive even remotely. But nevertheless, I think we should call it what it is. And I think illness is a real illness. And finally, of course, it is rooted very much in human alienation and very much in a social determination. You can see that not only from Pickett and Wilkinson's work, but many, many other studies as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Lots of interesting points there. Comrades, we've decided, unfortunately, to close the speakers list now because we are shattered for a start, and it's a bit unfair to rush you all along. We would ask you to come back next week to the second part of our show. We still have lots of issues around that issue to talk about, including from Jane, and hopefully also Ian Ferguson, who's written on the whole concept of mental health, Marxism and capitalism, who's a real looking forward to hearing him next week. Jackie, Chris, do you want to say anything?
I do want to say something, actually, because I think there's been some really good discussion. And I'm not, by the way, saying that we shouldn't take medication. I'm all for taking drugs. Human beings for millennia have taken drugs to do all sorts of things. What I'm trying to say is that we should come away from the medicalization of everything in the way we respond to it. But one thing I take from this, and I learned this from Chris and from going to RAG, and it fed into all my political work. It's why I did a play and why I did a film. It's because if you actually want to change people politically, we need, as the left, to put more joy into our protest, because sometimes, you know, going to a bloody Labour Party meeting, honestly, I wanted to slit my throat. If you wanted to get really depressed, go to a Labour Party meeting, it would get you depressed. And most marches, most meetings are a bit deadly. Get some joy there, get some music, get some fun, and you'll actually attract people to our movement. And that's what we need to be doing.
Absolutely. Chris, any last words from you?
I can't follow that. Brilliant.
Yep, Labour Party meetings. I mean, that's one of the advantages of being chucked out early in that struggle. My God, they were awful. Talking about control, I mean, there were, you know, 2-3 people in charge. There was no chance of trying to even get a foothold into all of that. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us tonight. We've scratched the surface a little bit tonight. We want to go deeper next week, and we'll see you there. Bye-bye. Thank you, Chris.